Okay, so welcome everyone to Incident Analysis and Human Factors. So what are we going to be talking about this evening? So we're going to basically cover an introduction to the BSAC incident report, what it includes and why we should read it. We're going to dip into human factors and we're going to have a review of selected incidents. So this is a high-level look at lots of other things that are already available on the BSAC website, but we think it's very important. This session is aimed predominantly at people doing their dive leader qualification, but obviously it's useful for everybody in the BSAC community, in the wider diving community. So it's going to cover lots of high-level things, and we'll go into a little bit more detail as we go along. Now tonight we've got some polls, and what I want you to do is to head to the poll now, and for those of you familiar with how we normally run things with our sessions, we tend to ask questions as we go through. Tonight it's a little bit different. I want you guys to head to the link now, and we're going to go and run through some questions very quickly. And the reason for that will become evident as we run through the questions, because I'm going to present the answers at the end of the session so that we can have a think about the answers that you've given and whether or not you might change any of those, or well, not change the answers, but actually change your behaviors. So it's really important that you are 100% honest in this poll. It's 100% anonymous, so you don't worry too much if you are a bit shy about admitting to some of these things. But don't worry. So hopefully Michael in the background is controlling the poll. So there we go. We're gonna go through these quite quickly. So first of all, for those of you who've got access to it now, quick question: have you ever rushed when putting your equipment together when perhaps others have finished before you? So this is quite a common one, I think, for a lot of people. I'm just going to give it a few minutes, a few more seconds for people to come up with their answers. Yeah, we're getting a lot of votes in. We've got 60 odd voters, so that's great. So Mike, do you want to stick on to the next question? Okay, next one. Have you ever found yourself overheating in a dry suit when a buddy took a little longer than you expected to kit up? So remember, guys, be honest. It doesn't matter if you have or haven't at this stage. Okay, we've got 80 votes. All right, let's have a look at the next question, Mike. Now here's a bit of a tough one. Have you ever skipped or forgotten a buddy check? I've put the two together there because deliberately skipping is something that I hope none of you will have done. But have you ever forgotten to do a buddy check or passed over it? Okay. Yeah, okay, let's move on to the next question then, Mike. All right, have you ever tried to squeeze an extra dive out of kit which was due a service? So this might be a regulator, or it might be trying to sneak a cylinder into the line of stuff to be filled. Perhaps it's a BCD that you've never, ever had serviced, because that's quite common, isn't it? Okay, what about the next question? Have you ever felt pressured to dive when you didn't feel confident? I've got some ideas of what I hope you'll be answering, but again, just to emphasize, please be as truthful as possible. And now this next question, which Mike's going to bring us on to, is for those of you who answered yes. Okay, so if you did feel pressure to dive when you didn't feel confident, did you actually dive? Did you go through with it? Okay, great stuff. Right, we're going to stop the poll there. I'll take that away. And we are going to now go to the session itself. So we'll come back to those results at the end, and I think they'll be quite enlightening. So first of all, let's talk about the incident report itself. So the incident report's available on the BSAC website. We're one of the few organisations that publish this sort of information. And what it does is it summarizes and provides some high-level analysis of all of the incidents that are reported to BSAC throughout the year. And this report is broken down into a number of categories. So you've got fatalities, decompression, putting in service, sense, technique related, equipment related, illness or injury related, miscellaneous, and then overseas sort of tagged on the end there. And what you can see there in front of you is an example of what it looks like if you've not seen the incident report before. And so that's, as you can see there, that's a bit of a sort of blurb surrounding some graphs. And what I've done is I've pulled out some of the information from those from this year's report. So well, it's 2019, but the most recent report, and taken and cherry picked basically the most important takeaway points from this. So the first one is where we look at incidents by month. And one of the first things you'll notice with that graph is that there is a very, very direct correlation between the number of incidents happening and the seasons. So you can see that once we get to May, things really start to spike, and we start to see a lot more incidents. That's a trend that's been there for time immemorial in the diving community. And this is reflective basically of the amount of diving that's occurring. So as we get into the warmer months and the seas are getting a little bit more flat, then we tend to see more divers out there, and obviously more diving means more scope for accidents and incidents. So that's what tends to happen. Now, here's the more interesting graph to my mind. It's a little bit more, it's a little bit less mundane. It's the incidents broken down by category. Okay, so what we can see is by far and away the most common incidents that we had in the 2019 report were those relating to the DCI. So what these mean is, so you might think, well, DCI is directly tied to ascents. And you would be absolutely right in thinking that. The way that the classifications work in the incident report is that if you've got two contributing factors like an ascent or DCI, it's the most serious one or the most serious attributable factors. Tripping over my words there. So so most DCIs tend to get lumped into DCI, whereas ascents don't necessarily relate to DCIs, so don't necessarily automatically cause a DCI. So there's an entire section there on its own. And we can see, yeah, the overall increase in the number of incidents is due to more instances of DCI. So overall, we've had a bit of an uptick in DCI and injury. If you look at the red bars, that's showing what our average is 2014 through 2018. And you can see that the blue bars are showing that there is a bit of an increase. So what else can we look at in the report? So we can have a look at the dive depth. And this is, there needs to be a little bit of interpretation that goes around these things. So I've written in the blue text there, the pattern of the max depth of a dive. It gave rise to an incident which is probably a reflection of the amount of diving that takes place at these depth ranges. So just because you see a large number of incidents in 2019 that happened in the 11 to 20 meters range, that doesn't mean to say that that particular range is any more dangerous than, say, the 51 to 60 meters range, where you can see there's very few dives occurring. What it means is that there's many hundreds, perhaps even now thousands of dives that are happening in that range, and just by virtue of the fact that there are that number of dives occurring, that there are going to be incidents that happen associated with those depths. Now, incident doesn't always occur at the deepest point of the dive. Indeed, it's actually it's not often on the super deep dives, these 51, 60 meter ranges, that the incident happens at the deepest point of the dive. More often than not, they happen during the ascent or near to the surface, or indeed on the surface. I'm being asked in the text chat here, do I have a total number of dives to give relation to the proportion? We don't, because that would mean that everyone in BSAC would have to sort of report their numbers of dives in a year, and obviously we don't do that. So unfortunately not. There are some sort of normalizing factors in the report that they use, which is usually based on the membership number, which is that helps to sort of level these statistics and make them slightly more indicative. So yeah, going back to depth, as I mentioned, the deepest point of the diving always the place where the incident starts. So the commencement depth is also recorded in a lot of these incidents, and as you can see, it's very common for it to happen on the surface. So divers make their way to the surface, and then something happens, whether that's as a DCI or anything else for that matter. It usually happens near to the surface. So we can take away learning from that. So, you know, just because you're making your way to the surface and you can see the top of the shot line or the buoy or whatever, it doesn't mean that that's now a time to become complacent. Just from that graph there, that tells you that, that actually, when you get near to the surface, that's the time when you possibly want to be the most observant of all periods on the dive. Okay, so also on the surface incidents, that involves boats and boating incidents. So and also people who end up getting lost or swept away from the dive boats. There's quite a large number of those when you get into the reports. So that is why there is quite a bit of a skew. But as you can see, there is a definite trend there. You'll note from minimal incidents happening at 60 meters right through to once you get to the 1 to 10 meter, yeah, things start to pick up. And then here's an interesting one. So incidents by diver grade, and I'm not sure whether people had expectations with what they thought might be how this is skewed. Now, one thing that you can take away from this graph straight away is that just by being an advanced diver or a first-class diver, it doesn't make you immune from being part of an incident. You can see that. Now, I'm being asked by Ian, are these stats UK only? So the international statistics are included, but they're very much a minority. Most of the incidents that are reported are predominantly BSAC dives within the UK. So what you can see is that, as I said, the higher level of qualification doesn't mean that you're not going to get an incident. But what can be taken from this is that, you know, the types of diving that perhaps an advanced diver might do when compared to an ocean diver, those dives might be slightly more risky, or the impact of a risk occurring is greater because they're going to be at a greater depth. They might have had a higher nitrogen load. Excuse me. So you might say an advanced diver or a first-class diver is extremely competent. That's absolutely true. They shouldn't have got that qualification without that. But because they're doing slightly more challenging diving, then that can counteract the reduction in the likelihood from them being competent by the types of diving that they're doing. So so yeah, so you can see that there's some information there on diver grades. Now we get onto the sort of the tougher side of things in the report, and for those of you who haven't read what the BSAC incident report before, you might be surprised to see that there's a lot of detail that goes into the fatalities. Now, in 2019, there were 13 fatalities, unfortunately, in that incident. So 13 people lost their lives through the course of diving. Now, in some respects, that's good news because it's slightly below the average. but obviously that's 13 people that aren't going home to their families, so it's a very serious thing that we want to cast a spotlight onto. Now, the analysis of that, so the average age of those fatalities, first of all, is quite an interesting one. It's 58.2, with one of those divers being in their 70s. So the average age of all of the incidents across the report this year was 43.6. So you can see that the fatalities are generally divers who are a little bit older than the average incident reporter. So that tells you something about what can be a contributing factor to fatalities. There is a correlation between age and the likelihood of dying in a diving incident, and that's quite unfortunate. So let's have a look at the fatalities, and this is information that's contained in the report that I've visualized. So we've got a total of 13 divers who lost their lives. Now, of those incidents, 9 of them were where divers fell unconscious underwater. So what that tells us is that potentially if they fell unconscious underwater, if they weren't with a dive buddy, which is not information that's shown in this graph, if they weren't with a dive buddy, then the chances of them being rescued are significantly diminished. So diving on your own and getting separated is a big contributing factor. And one thing that contributes to separation is diving in groups, that any group other than a pair. So we tend to say that buddy pair diving is the safest. So of the fatalities, so there is overlap between these. So of the 13 that died last year, 4 of those were diving in trios or more, or in groups of 3 or more. And what that can indicate is with trios, and we'll look at an example of this a little bit later on, but the chance of separation is much higher. You'd think it wouldn't be, but with a trio diving, the chance of separation is much higher. And that's because of some of the things that we'll talk about with human factors, actually. So separation, like I say, those 9 people fell unconscious underwater and didn't survive. Now, of those 13 total, 2 of them started alone. So we can say probably or possibly that 2 of those 9, we don't know, but 2 people started out alone. And also 4 people became separate. Now, are those 4 the same 4 that were diving in trios? We don't know, but there's a correlation between the 2, and there's a link, and I would be surprised if there wasn't an overlap between those 2. Now, also another relatively hot topic, and it's one that you can refer back to in the catch-up on the webinars, is immersionary pulmonary edema. Now, this is a condition where the body starts to express fluid into the lungs, and essentially an individual can drown while still being conscious, breathing, and so on. So it's quite a serious condition. It's very difficult to spot and diagnose, but it is something that we need to be increasingly aware of. So in 13 of those cases, pulmonary edema was indicated. It doesn't say that it was necessarily immersion pulmonary edema, but pulmonary edema no less. And then finally, and this is where I mention age is a factor, we've got pre-existing conditions. So 2 of those individuals had significant pre-existing conditions, and those individuals, I am not privy to their medical records or any of that side of things. I'm taking all of this analysis straight out of the public incident report, which is obviously being careful not to share details that they don't have the right to. But if they had two of those had significant pre-existing conditions, were they fit to dive? Would they have passed the UK DMC checklist that you're supposed to do every year or every time that there's a change in your medical condition? And so 2 of them had significant, and 9, so together that's 11 out of the 13, had indications of a pre-existing condition. So we don't know what those conditions might be. It could be, you know, issues to do with the heart. So maybe there were issues surrounding the efficacy of their heart. Maybe there were issues surrounding their lungs or their brain. We don't have that information to hand. What we do have is those headline figures that tells you 11 out of the 13 people that died had conditions. So this also is takeaway point. The takeaway point is that your medical is increasingly important. So as you get older, your diving medical is important no matter what age, but as you get older and older, actually you need to start paying much more attention to the signs that your body is giving you. And if you've got even the slightest suspicion that something might be awry, you need to report that either to your GP or to your diving doctor, and make sure you get a full workup. It's not worth the risk. Okay, so that's a breakdown of the fatalities. Now, I mentioned this earlier in the beginning, why we should read the report. Now, safe diving, which it used to be a printed thing, I think it still is a printed thing, to be fair, but it's now available in a great format online on the BSAC website, the safe diving practices. It gives you guidance for all the diving that we do, and all of the diving that you do as a BSAC diver should be conducted within the rules of the Safe Diving Guide. Now, almost all of those incidents that are in the report could have been avoided had they followed the guidance within this magical book. So that's a big takeaway point there. If you haven't read Safe Diving by BSAC, you should read it. It's not a massive tome. It's not you know, War and Peace. It's a quite short and to the point book, and it's very useful. I've read it a few times now. It's very, very useful document. Now, the other reason why we should read this report, and this is part of what I'm trying to get into today, is analysis of this report helps us to identify our own risky behaviours. And this is why I asked you all those questions at the start of the session. It helps us to realise that perhaps some of the things that we've conditioned ourselves to be believing are okay, they're perhaps not. And by looking at the report and seeing the facts in the cold light of day, might add some weight to the outcome, to the implications of what you're doing and what that risky behaviour could turn into. So I've mentioned this already. Human factors is an important, and it's a hot topic at the moment, especially within the BSAC community. Now, it's so hot a topic that we have a website or a subpage of the BSAC website dedicated to it. So it's bsac.com/human factors. And if you log in, you'll find that there are 2 videos there. And I've shamelessly plundered those videos for some content for this session. So if you have watched them already, you'll see some familiar points being made. But if not, I haven't plundered them to the extent that by sitting through this session means that you shouldn't watch them. They are very, very useful. The first of which is Human Factors in the World of Diving. That was that was brought together by a gentleman called Mike Mason. It's an incredibly moving piece of work, and it covers one incident at the start and then talks a little bit more about human factors and how they applied to that incident. Then there's also another recording from one of the BSAC conferences. Excuse me. One of the BSAC conferences recently. I was there. I watched this presentation. It was a great one to watch, and it's called "The Shortest Road to Increased Safety in Diving," presented by a New Zealand gentleman called Simon Mitchell, who's got a lot of useful knowledge and a lot of good things to say about human factors. Now, what is human factors? What is the whole concept of it? What's it about? So it's essentially an approach or a methodology, or at least an understanding of it is an approach and methodology pioneered predominantly by the aviation and engineering industries. But as I say, I'm not going to get too much into the detail of this because I'll be stealing other people's thunder that you should be watching anyway. Now, it kind of think of it as a what are human factors and how do they apply to you? Well, they're physical or cognitive properties of individuals. So that's the way your body works physiologically, or the way your mind works. And sometimes it can also include social behaviour. So how do you react to situations? How do you react within a group? And that side of things. So there is psychology involved in this. It's human error is a term that's often referred to, but it's one that it implies blame, and it's one that I'm trying to steer away from today. So I'm not going to talk about blame. I'm not going to talk about error per se. We're going to talk about what things could have been done to perhaps avoid, and the questions that we need to be asking. Now, interestingly enough, there was a 1997 study with regards to diving fatalities, and it found that less than 5% of those fatalities were attributable to a single cause. It was lots of small causes that built up to it, and the conclusion of that report is that we can't remove every single link, every single possible factor. What we can do is try and minimize them and put rules in place and processes, policy, procedures that will help us minimize that, but we can't eliminate them. If we were to try and eliminate them, there'd be so much red tape and bureaucracy that we wouldn't be able to actually effectively dive. So there is a certain element of risk there. Now, to go back to Professor Mitchell, here he is at the BSAC conference. Here's a quote that I've pinched from his presentation. Now, violations. So this is where you might be tempted to break the rules, and some of those rules we went through in the poll already. Those violations don't arise from incompetence. You've been taught what you should be doing, haven't you? You know the rules. They're a conscious decision to not follow those rules. And this is where human factors really starts to come into things. And he goes on to talk about things like corrupt motivations. So these are pressures that we might put on ourselves unknowingly, or we might put on others. So things like not holding the team up, not wanting to be the one to cancel a dive, or not wanting to admit a fault with equipment. Maybe it's going to cost you loads of money to repair that thing, or maybe you're trying to get one extra dive out of the oxygen cell in a rebreather. Okay, so these are things like corrupt motivations. Now, human factors, there are error-producing conditions. So these are things that contribute to these incidents. And there's you know, in diving, we've got lots of acronyms. Well, here's another one, WITH, W-I-T-H. So the W stands for work environment. And this is where things might be bothering you from externally. So things like distractions and interruptions. So whether you're trying to put your kit together and someone comes and starts chatting away in your ear, whether something suddenly changes at the last minute, maybe something isn't displaying as you expected, you know, like unexpected conditions within the equipment, and lots of other stuff going on. So that's the work environment. Then you've got other areas like individual capabilities. So whether or not you're competent, essentially. Some things come into that, like your ability to communicate, or whether you're communicating effectively. And obviously there's one which is quite important for diving, which is illness or fatigue, whether or not you're actually fit to dive. Then we've got the task demand. So we, you know, as divers, we'll have, you know, a few different types of dives that we go on. Sometimes it might be just descend, go for a bimble, and then come up again, nice and simple. But other times we might be doing something slightly more complicated. So perhaps you're training, perhaps you're going to dive with a purpose, you've got a project that's on. All of these things have associated tasks with them. And those tasks all add into the mix. They're all extra pressures that are that are sort of making life more difficult, making the job more difficult. And then finally, the last letter, H, you've got human nature. So things like, are you actually stressed? Now, you can start to see that some of these things might feed into other categories, which is fine. That's fair. So you've got things like stress, which might be a product of some of the others. You've also got habit patterns. So I've done it this way for all the way through my diving career. I'm going to continue doing it regardless of the fact that guidance might have changed. Then there's, some of the bad behaviors like assumptions and complacency and overconfidence, general mindset. So those are all things that can contribute to producing errors. So errors underwater or when we're diving are what cause incidents. Okay. Now I'm going to bring up a slide which you should be familiar with for those of you who've dived as BSAC divers for X number of years. And I'm going to bring it in with the case of Brian Bugg, who's the person that unfortunately died in and was the case study for the video that I mentioned earlier. Now, there are numerous factors that contributed to Brian's demise. Here they are. I'm not going to list them all. I'm not going to read through them all, but they are all contributing factors. Okay. Now, ultimately, all of these combined in the incident pit. So they're all lots of small individual incidents. And as you combine them, they start to concatenate and they start to impact on each other and become slightly more serious incidents. So in the case of Brian, he rushed into the water. He had not set up his equipment correctly and he put extra pressures on himself. There was lots of frustrations that built up to the day. And ultimately that meant he got into the water and then as he descended, he didn't have enough oxygen within his loop and he passed out and died. Now, none of those errors were constituted a grave error. Okay, all of them were resolvable. All of them could have been fixed, but when they were all combined together, they produced a fatality. Now, one way of looking at it is we've got the incident pit, which is a fairly clear diagram, and I hope you understand where we're coming from on the incident pit. Another way, which some of you might be familiar with, is the Swiss cheese model. I'm going to try and play a video. This is a video produced by some of the guys at the Human Diver. And you can see there, you've got these sort of slices of cheese with holes in it, like Swiss cheese. Now, each one of those is a protection. It's a method for stopping things happening, stopping bad things happening. Okay, I'm going to rewind and play it again. Now, each layer of protection isn't 100% perfect. We mentioned already that we can't make diving 100% safe. So that's fine. Each one of those barriers will help us protect us for, say, 90% of the time. The problem comes when those holes in the cheese line up, as you can see now. So when they line up, that's when the chain of events starts to happen and you end up with an incident occurring. Just to give credit where it's due, there we go. So that animation was by Professor James Reason and it was modified by Gareth Locke. So there you go. So thanks to those guys for producing that. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at human incidents and we're going to move on to actually looking at actual real world things that happened from that report. So I wanted to add a word of caution with regards to this. So we're looking at this in hindsight, and as they say, it's 2020, isn't it? But it's very easy for us to sit on our ivory towers and cast judgment on the individuals that were part of these incidents. But I counsel you to remember that these are real incidents, they're real people, so try to bear that in mind. So bear that in mind if you're making any comments in the chat, that people who know these individuals or potentially are friends with them might be in this chat. So just bear that in mind. And also please bear in mind that the purpose of this section is not to apportion blame. That's absolutely not what I'm here to do, and it's not to criticize anyone for any actions. Okay, the reason why we're talking about this today is to highlight how those human factors might have been a contributor. Just by my highlighting them doesn't mean to say they were definitely a contributing factor. but to take away learnings from those incidents and influence your own behaviour. Okay, so the analysis that we're looking at here, we can only do from the published details. There may be more knowledge that some of you know with relation to some of these incidents, but let's keep that to one side. We're only going to be looking at the published data, because the point of today's session is that you in future years read future reports and analyse and look at it in your own time and take away similar learnings. So that's the reason why we're doing that. So let's move on and have a look at some incidents. So I've put the incident references, so for those of you who have downloaded the incident report, you can cross-reference, because you might notice that I've trimmed for brevity some of the commentary. So in June 2019, a charter rib came across 2 divers in the water, one of which was unresponsive. They recovered the divers, commenced CPR, issued a mayday, and the Coast Guard sent lots of people to help. The diver was taken to hospital and was pronounced deceased a short time later. Now, after the event, the buddy reported that they'd been shore diving to 7 meters for 40 minutes. So a relatively safe sort of depth to be diving at, and 40 minutes it is not an unrealistic amount of time to dive. So from that information, it's very hard to determine a root cause, isn't it? So what I'd like to highlight here is the questions that you should be asking yourselves when you read this. And the questions that came to my mind are these. So the first one is, did the divers have shore cover? For those of you who sat through my sessions on dive planning, you'll know that shore cover is quite important. There's lots of ways of approaching it, but it is important, as is planning. Now, my thoughts on this situation were, did the divers, now they've been picked up by ribs, okay, so they're a little bit wear out, I imagine. Did they plan to be that far out from the shore, or did they accidentally deviate from their plan and find themselves too far? But at any rate, their dive plan, had they thought about how far they would have to swim back to shore if they did run into trouble? So that's hard to say, isn't it? I'm not casting aspersions or making conclusions. These are just questions that we can ask ourselves, and then when we go to plan a shore dive, perhaps we can think about, well, okay, that was a situation. Maybe I'm going to plan my diving in a way that will hopefully mitigate against this. Okay, so let's have a look at another shore diving example. So we've got a group of 5 divers, July 2019, so a group of 5 divers in a shore dive. And we've got a buddy pair and a group of 3. They went and did their dive. Now, they did some buddy checks and a buoyancy check, but then they had a bit of a separation thing. The group's slightly separated because someone needed extra weight, which is, it's very common, isn't it? Now, after 25 minutes, the diver signalled to the leader that the gas contents were down to 50 bar, which is already a danger sign, isn't it? 50 bar is right in the red zone, and is probably not in line with the rule of thirds, which we should be planning to. And if they were diving to the rule of thirds, they'd have obviously got into the water with 150 bar, which is not great. The dive leader signalled to that diver to ascend, and then he turned around to the 3rd diver in the group, and then when he turned back around, the diver was no longer in view. Now, from the surface, that other diver was seen about 80 to 100 meters from shore, facing north rather than west, towards where the shore party was located. The diver was seen to be swimming steadily on his front, and then eventually it all went wrong, raised his arms in distress, and then sank from view. This poor unfortunate soul was located the next day, and post-mortem, which sometimes we have access to, had the diver had an ischemic heart disease, which was a contributing factor. Now, the questions that I asked myself on this one Well, first of all, is diving in a trio advisable? Well, sometimes it's unavoidable, isn't it? But is it advisable? Perhaps not. Are there things that we can do and procedures that we can put in place? Possibly. Something that occurred to me: 25 minutes into a dive at 8 meters, and the diver has breathed through most of their tank. Now that in itself is an interesting one, isn't it? You would expect at 8 meters for a tank to last a lot longer. So my thoughts went to whether it was observed that that diver was breathing heavily, which might be an indication that there's a problem. Had diver separation been briefed? I know that the separation was happening in line with a medical condition, but had separation been briefed? It mentions that the divers went up and they got on their ascent. They went to check depth at 6 meters, but could not see the diver. Now, I wonder, did they do a safety stop, or did they make their way to the surface? Was a safety stop mandatory? Well, on a dive to 8 meters for 25 minutes, obviously there are lots of variables involved, but I would read it that perhaps the safety stop wasn't mandatory and could have been omitted. Were SMBs used? You know, if there was an SMB, would the diver have been able to cling on to that rather than swimming? Was northerly the right direction? No, it wasn't. It was westerly that the diver should have been swimming back to. So could anything have been done when they realised that the diver was swimming in the wrong direction? Could there have been an intervention there? I don't know. So these are all questions that I've asked myself about this incident, and I'll take away from those when I'm planning a shore dive. So what about rebreather? And a couple of people have asked about rebreather incidents. So we've got one here. We've got a diver was seen to complete his rebreather checks, so he's done the right thing. And what's happened is that they descended and found a large trawler net snagged on the wreck, and there was an entanglement issue. The diver disentangled the buddy, and then they descended to sort of recover from that. Now, the diver had a problem with one of their computers and signalled that he was going to ascend. So they made their way back to the shot line, which is absolutely the right decision. So the process is working at this point. On the shot line, they encountered another buddy pair, and they decided to try and sort of buddy up with that buddy pair. And a few various things happened. But what happened was that the diver on the rebreather started to ascend quickly up the shot line ahead of the buddies that he was supposed to be with, and was quickly lost out of sight in the visibility. And then that was it. They weren't seen again. And ultimately it was found, the diver was found, and the cause of the incident was found that the computer had a crack in the screen, the computer that controls the rebreather, and the diver had died of hypoxia, so they hadn't the rebreather hadn't been putting oxygen into the loop, and that person passed out and unfortunately died. Now, things that you think about with relation to this. So did that diver ascend so quickly because they had an issue, or did the issue begin on the shot line at some point when they were separated from the other two? Had the deviation, so what they decided to do, so you know, okay, we're going to go back to the line, and then suddenly shuffling round of the buddy pairs, had that been briefed or planned? So had they thought about, okay, if this happens, then you'll go with this person if we encounter that, or anything like that? Was that diver well versed and well practiced? This is the more important thing, with the resolutions that are unique to diving on a rebreather. So for those of you in the audience who are rebreather divers, you'll know all of this already, but for those of you who aren't, there's lots of procedures that you can go through to try and put yourself into a better footing if something goes wrong or your computer's not reading. So you might be sort of hearing familiar themes coming through. If you think about some of the things that might go wrong, they tally back to that human factors, what can be contributory. So in this situation, perhaps that diver was seeing things on their display that they weren't expecting. Maybe the display was giving confusing readings or conflicting readings. And there are procedures in place to help deal with that. But was that diver well practiced? It's hard to say, isn't it? And was the display in good condition prior to the dive? Now, there's no information to make a judgment on that in the report. It could be that the display got cracked in the process of untangling the divers from the trawler net, or it could be that there was a small hairline crack that wasn't observed. But one thing that I would take away from that is that before entering the water, I'll try and do a very clear check on any computer screens or display screens of the equipment that I've got to see if I can see any hairline cracks or anything like that. Because that equipment, whilst it's just a little box on your wrist, it is your life support equipment, so it's very important. So those are some takeaway points that we can learn from it, even though we don't have exact details. What about another situation? Okay, so we've got a person here who was on a week's diving trip on a hard boat. They were a little bit rusty, so they did a pool refresher session. And then they had a wobble on their first dive, and they needed helping out. And when they got back onto the boat, they were panicked and they needed some help. They were obviously quite spooked by the whole situation. They were in shock, but then later on they expressed they were going to take a day off, and then they were keen to get back at it on the Wednesday. And then Wednesday comes, they go for a dive, and signalled that the casualty signalled that they were uncomfortable, and they and their buddy both immediately ascended. By the time they got to the surface and called for help, the diver was unconscious, but unfortunately didn't survive that incident. So there's not much information there to tell us what the cause of death was, but there are some things that we could infer, or questions that we could ask. So, was the second fatal incident as a result of panic? There'd been panic after the first dive. Could there have been panic on the second dive? Now, coming back to those human incidents, this is the first time in water. This diver was the first into the water on the Wednesday. Now, why were they first into the water? Did they feel rushed? Were they trying to push to get into the water first? Had they put pressure on themselves to make it look like they were competent and confident diver, when they really weren't? We don't know, but all of those things, they feed back into that human factors, don't they? Things that can contribute to an issue. And another issue that's that I imagine lots of people in the audience tonight will have encountered are equipment issues, and quite commonly with new equipment. So new equipment is one. A diver carried out a hard boat dive, and this person on the boat was chatting with a solo diver, and was asking about a 7-litre manifolded twin set that they'd recently acquired, and asked the solo diver to explain to them how their own equipment should work, which is an interesting proposition. The solo diver explained how it all worked, but then ultimately the diver with the twin set decided to not use it as a manifolded twin set, but to close the manifold and dive them as independent cylinders. So something that they were slightly more familiar with, which is a sensible approach in some respects, isn't it? You go with what you know. Now, the boat anchors onto the wreck, and then the diver with the twin set was asked to help with some of the equipment, the shot line and the lift bag. but they weren't familiar with that. So they were shown how to use it whilst they were moored up on the wreck. So instead of it being a case of just jumping into the water, instead this diver was now looking at equipment and trying to work out how it works. And in the end, they didn't do that part of the dive. Actually, it was the solo diver who did that. And then there was a bit of faff with getting into kits. I think lots of you will have encountered this. You get all your kit on and then realise you've forgotten your weight belt. So you de-kit, put the weight belt back on. And then you jump in the water and then lo and behold, there's a free flow. You know, we're getting a sort of litany of errors here, or problems. So the diver whose regulator began to free flow climbed back aboard and began to de-kit. But what we don't know is whether or not that diver's buddy had seen him signal that there was a problem and that diver continued to descend the shot line. Now we can only assume that they thought that they were buddy, but they weren't. So what carried on? So about 5 minutes later, the solo diver entered the water as well. And then he did the stuff that he was supposed to on the shot line. But then there was no sign of the other diver. You'd think that maybe the diver would be waiting at the shot line for their buddy to appear. So he followed the shot line across the deck. So he still hadn't found the individual. Then he connected a distance line and started reeling out from the shot line. And a couple of minutes later, he saw light in the distance, and there is the diver. And this diver is unconscious. The regulator isn't in their mouth, and the solo diver conducted a rescue, brought them to the surface, but unfortunately that person died at the scene. So the examination of that diver's equipment, it was found all to be fully working, which is an interesting situation. So lots of questions came to my mind on this with relation to the human factors. So one of the ones that I mentioned earlier is distraction. So this is that work environment, the W, the W point. Had they been distracted? Well, possibly yes. They were doing that, the lift bag work on the surface. Had they been ill? Yes, the diver had shown signs of being sick, seasick. Had anything contributed to that? And had the diver put pressure on themselves? Arguably, it's a strong possibility. You know, they wanted to dive with the equipment and get the most out of it, or potentially also to dive when ill. I know from personal experience, having been out on dive boats, I've seen lots of divers who really will grin and bear it, despite being almost catastrophically seasick, because they've paid good money for a dive. Were time pressures a factor? So sometimes diving on a skippered boat, skipper wants you off the boat and then wants you back on the boat in short time, don't they? So were time pressures a factor in this? And then had a descent procedure been planned or briefed? Almost every diving agency out there has a procedure with regards to a proper descent, and it appears that these procedures hadn't been followed. So that's something to think about, something to take away. Do you all of you out there have a descent procedure? You know, clear signal, okay, everybody's okay, let's go down. Or also, had a separation procedure been planned or briefed? So we hopefully are all familiar with the one up, all up rule, or some of you might be also familiar with the 1 minute rule. You know, if you find yourself separated, look around for a minute. Had these things been briefed? Perhaps they had, perhaps they hadn't. But these are all mitigations that could help in a situation like this. Okay, and now we're moving away from the fatalities now, thankfully. So it's not nice talking about those. But let's talk about DCI. So we've got an incident here where we've got a diver and they do a few dives, Now, at the end of the first dive, they surface with a rash on their chest. It disappears, but they've got a bit of an ache in the shoulder, which they put down to hanging off a DSMB. Well, they shouldn't have been hanging off the DSMB, arguably, but still, with an abundance of caution, they declined to do the second dive that day because of this niggling suspicion about the rash. So they thought, they were already thinking that perhaps there was DCI at play here. And then, so they didn't do the second dive, and then they went out to do a third dive. At the end of the third dive, they got back aboard. It's a relatively deep dive, 33 meters. They got back aboard, and then they got this itchy rash had come back, dull ache across both shoulders. Now, it was that diver was put on O2, quite rightly, and then evacuated to hyperbaric chamber, where they were treated quite successfully. So, questions to ask yourself. Okay, so I teach this all the time. What's the first symptom of decompression illness listed in the BSAC materials? The first symptom, the top of the list, is denial. And yeah, this diver, we can be perhaps a little bit harsher because this person obviously survived, and it's not too harsh to speak of someone who survived. This diver had ignored the symptoms that are presented, that we're taught so often, every single course. What are the symptoms of decompression illness? Denial, rash, pain in joints. He'd ignored those symptoms and then decided to continue diving. Should we ignore those symptoms? Absolutely not. And then finally, it was noted that the dive computer had locked out into error mode. Now, was the diver aware of this? Were they familiar with that particular dive computer? Dive computers tend not to lock out without you doing something that they strongly counterindicate. So ignoring a sealing, a decompression sealing, would lock out the computer. So perhaps this diver had ignored their computer as well. An interesting proposition. I'm not sure I would feel comfortable doing that, but perhaps it shouldn't have been a surprise to them that there was an issue there. Okay, let's have a look at another example of decompression illness. So we've got a diver who carries out a dive to 28 meters for 38 minutes. And then they got tingling in their wrists, which they'd attributed to their wrist seals. For some of you might have encountered that. In the meantime, the second wave of divers enters the water, and the diver's condition didn't improve. So he decided to give himself oxygen for 15 minutes, and his symptoms improved, which is good news, eh? So they didn't bother calling the Coast Guard. They recovered the divers and then made their way back to shore. Now, next morning, diver awoke with weakness down one side of their body and referred themselves to the hyperbaric chamber. He received not one but 2 sessions of recompression and was reported to have made a full recovery. Now, this is very serious, actually, because a lateral numbness and tingling of the entire body shows that there's quite a serious problem going on with their central nervous system. So the questions that we ask ourselves, so, well, what's the worst that had happened? Well, the person could have paralyzed themselves. But again, what's the first symptom of decompression illness listed in the materials? It's denial, isn't it? Now, at 28 meters for 38 minutes, it's quite a long dive at a reasonable depth. Obviously, we don't have access to the full dive profile. It could have been 1 minute at 28 meters and the rest at 10. Who's to say? But should DCI be suspected on a dive profile like that? Absolutely should be. And the important takeaway point here, after first aid has been administered, so 100% oxygen being provided, and you start to feel better, should you just ignore it? No, absolutely not. A hyperbaric doctor should be consulted, so you should always get in touch, even out of just an abundance of caution. If it means you have to go into the pot for a little while and then stay off diving for a couple of weeks, is probably better than the alternative, which is risking a life-changing illness or injury, sorry. Okay, here's another one. Lost divers. Here's another incident that some of you may be familiar with. Now, this is one that's come from the Coast Guard, actually. And a distress signal was received by them, and they tasked some lifeboats to the Mayday, to that signal. And when they got near, it was a responding vessel reported that there was a dive boat in the area who, upon contact, reported that they had 3 overdue divers. So this is most likely the cause of the distress signal. Now, luckily, those divers were located by the lifeboat and found to be fit and well. And what had happened was that they'd surfaced and were unable to see their boat. So they were really lucky they had a VHF radio. So they attempted to contact the boat. And there was no response. So they pressed the DSC, the Digital Selective Calling Distress button. Now, the divers were well equipped. They had lots of kit that lots of other divers don't even have. And they were found miraculously within 370 meters of their original signal. So they had drifted quite a way, but they were still found. But there was concern that the dive boat that they were diving off didn't respond to their radio hails, or indeed the Mayday relay broadcast that was issued later on. So what can we ask ourselves from this? Well, what contributed to the successful rescue? So this is where the incident report comes into its own as well, is where we learn from the successful rescues. This could have gone much worse, couldn't it? But as it happens, those divers had extra equipment that many of us don't have, including a marine radio with them, which ultimately was a serious contributor to them being rescued fit and well. But what could have been done differently on the Rib? Well, little things like, was the radio even on? Were the electrics on in the Rib at that time? Or quite possibly, were the divers trained in the radio procedures or in the operation of the radio? Was the radio turned down or something like that? Who's to say? But these are all things that we can take away from that. So perhaps when you're next planning a boat dive, then have a look at the incident reports with relation to lost divers and take away some learning points from those. Hopefully I'm beginning to drill this in. Okay, another. An instructor and his buddy, both using air, carried out a drift dive. And this instructor and the buddy, they used an SMB, and the person got their buddy to hold on to the SMB, and they began an ascent. And they got to about 10 meters when a buoy line came into view, and there was no time to react. So they found themselves wrapped around the buoy line. And the instructor ultimately took hold of the buddy, got them to regain attitude, at which point they'd noticed then that their SMB line's becoming taut, so it's obviously still wrapped around that buoy line. And they let out line, and the pair continued to ascend, even though the instructor had dumped all of the air from their BCD wing dry suit. Couldn't slow it down. It's out of control ascent. Now, that instructor has obviously found themselves with a decision whether or not to stay with the inexperienced diver and do a fast ascent, or did they decide to let them go and do a slow ascent in a drift dive? Ultimately, they decided to stay with the buddy. They made their way to the surface, computers going beep, beep, beep. That was the end of the story, as it were. Both divers recovered, no decompression illness, nothing like that. But it was discovered that later on, when the buddy was back on the boat, that the weight pouches had been ripped out of their BC when they'd hit the line, which is what presumably contributed to that uncontrolled ascent. So what can we learn from that? Could the outcome have been worse? Well, yes, absolutely could have been. Interacting with buoy lines on a drift dive is to be avoided. Could additional mitigations have been put in place? Quite possibly. So the divers could have been a little bit closer to each other, perhaps, things like that, or perhaps they could be facing in the direction of travel, all sorts of things. Were human factors at play? Almost certainly. There was distraction involved, stress, simultaneous multiple tasks, and irrecoverable actions. And had the buoy line scenario been briefed? So it's not mentioned in the description there, had the buoy line scenario been briefed. I can tell you that the buoy line scenario was briefed because I'm the instructor that was involved in this incident. And I've taken away some learning points from this. So it's I've learned from it, so there's no reason why you can't also learn from a mistake that happened to me. And it's also an important point to say that I've submitted an incident here that potentially some people with a bit more of an ego might choose not to submit an incident. I strongly encourage members in my club to submit whenever they have anything remotely like an incident, so that we can learn from them. So it's very important. So it's just a teaching point here that we should all be putting this information into HQ so that we can all learn from it. Okay, let's have another look at another ascent. So we've got this one's an interesting one. So we've got two divers going out. One of the divers has got some buoyancy issues. And then, yeah, they were a little bit rusty. And at the end of the dive, they made an ascent from 16 meters, an uncontrolled ascent, because they had air in their dry suit legs. So they got to the surface, and then after having this uncontrolled ascent, they redescended back down for a further 10 minutes, and then the diver ran out of air. So the diver's buddy performed an alternate source ascent, including a safety stop, and they surfaced after a duration of 53 minutes. So quite a long dive there. I recovered them. Both were a bit embarrassed. No symptoms of DCI, so lucky there. And the diver who the buddy who noticed the diver getting too floaty thought that she probably focused on the camera too much. And they both admitted to failing to carry out air checks, which is it's almost a cardinal sin, isn't it, in diving? So questions, could the outcome have been worse? It absolutely could have been worse. Uncontrolled ascent should be avoided at all costs. There's so many horrible outcomes that can happen from an uncontrolled ascent. Could mitigations have been put in place? I'm sure I'm not going to sort of teach you guys how to suck eggs. There's probably lots of different things that they could have done differently. One question in my mind was, given the scenario and the full details of that, which I'd let you read in your own time, had the diver been provided with appropriate training for the equipment that they were using, or were checklists and procedures followed? Possibly. Who's to say? And was good diving practice followed when redescending? That's a big question that you should ask yourself. If you were in that scenario and you descended from 16 meters rapidly to the surface, would you descend back down again? It's a question to ask yourself. Okay. Let's see, equipment. We're nearly there now. I just thought it useful to go through as many as we feasibly could in the time, but we are getting towards the end of these examples. So we've got a diver carrying out a dive in a full face mask, but they were familiar with it, and they were comfortable with the training that they were doing. Now, they found that when they were kneeling down at 15 meters, that the regulator came away from the mask, which then flooded. So they switched to their alternate air source, but unfortunately put it in the mouth upside down and inhaled water. At this point, they made a free ascent, suffered no ill effects other than some sinus issues. Now, after the incident, the diver found that the regulator hadn't been properly attached, which is interesting, isn't it? And they reported that they felt some of their skills had become rusty and accepted that they'd become complacent. So these are some human factors from those earlier slides. and plan to spend more time in a very shallow water practicing bailout drills. So they've obviously learned from their own mistake there, which is very positive to see. So we can ask ourselves some more questions. Could the outcome have been worse? It definitely could have been. Could additional mitigations have been put in place? Ask yourself what might you have put in place that could have stopped that? And had the diver been recently in good practice of the skills? Well, they've admitted in the report, they've admitted themselves that they'd become rusty and that they'd become complacent. So there are the human factors, aren't there? Complacency, stress, and simultaneous multiple actions that they're trying to do at the same time. One thing that occurred to me as well is just an observation. It might not be the case, but they put the regulator in upside down. Was the regulator mounted properly and routed properly so that they, when they went to use it, it was the right way up? Or did they need to have a look at how their equipment was configured so that it was easily usable by other divers, but also importantly by themselves? On a full face mask, arguably the alternate air source becomes extremely useful because there's more ways of failure on a full face mask than there are just a normal scuba regulator. Another example of equipment. So we've got this one's relating to a computer. So a diver's going on an accelerated decompression dive, and quite wisely had two computers with them. But at the end of the dive, the backup computer was displaying an alarm and a missed decompression warning. And when they inspected it, the diver's main computer was absolutely fine, as was the buddy's. But the problem was that backup computer that they'd got wasn't capable of doing mixed gas diving. It didn't have multi-gas capability. So it was giving a much longer ascent time than the other computer, which was capable of it. Now, that seems really weird to me, and I'm not sure I can understand the thought processes that went into this. But questions that we can ask. Could the outcome have been worse? Well, yeah, possibly, yeah, there could have been. And had the diver been recently in good practice of the skills? Well, I'm not sure. There's not enough information to make a full judgment on this, is there? But one question that struck me was the diver aware that this was a probable outcome? Now, if they got into did that diver get into the water knowing that their backup computer wasn't compatible with the dive that they were planning to do, or at least not compatible with the dive profile that their main computer was going to do? Now, my thought is that had they known that, they would have not done the dive, or they would have perhaps had their other computer engage mode. But I'm making inferences there that may not be the case. But some human factors that could have been at play. Well, there's habit patterns, obviously, assumptions, complacency, and potentially inaccurate risk perception. And there's certainly, I think, an element of unexpected equipment conditions. The diver didn't expect his backup computer to go into alarm. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done the dive profile that they did. So that brings us to the end of the examples, and hopefully I've not bored you to tears with these. I think actually, for me, they're quite interesting learning outcomes. But what can this tell us? So diving is an incredibly safe sport. Someone asked how many dives are conducted. We don't have those figures, but if you think about how many dives you've conducted in a year and then multiply that by the number of members that we've got within BSAC, you're looking in the many thousands of dives conducted each year. And thankfully, the number of serious incidents is very, very small in proportion to that. And this is because of the safety processes, procedures, checklists and such that we have in place. It doesn't happen by accident, it happens by design. Now, as mentioned, the majority of incidents do appear to be influenced by human factors. And going through the incident report like I've just done, you can pull out and these factors, you can identify them. If you identify them, you can minimize them, you can mitigate them, you can make the likelihood of them happening or the impact of that happening much smaller. So how do we mitigate human factors? So one of the key ways, which is mentioned by the other presenters in the sessions that I've referred to, we've got checklists, okay, which are super important. Now, I'm not sure. I think that we may have joining us in the chat today or in the background. We might have a pilot in the room tonight, and I've pulled this up because I think it's incredibly relevant. This is a checklist for an Airbus A320. And what you can see here is a very simple set of checks that are done by the pilots. Now, if we look at if we just pull out the section which is related to before putting the thing into the air, you can see that's a very, very small checklist. And that's because the purpose of the checklist is not to go through all of the knowledge of the pilot possesses, which is obviously quite an expansive amount of knowledge that they have. This checklist is there to make sure that they've done all the important things, all of the super, super important things that are easy to forget, but the impact of them is quite profound. So we can take away some of that, and it's worth pointing out that the airline industry, despite well-publicized incidents, is incredibly safe in terms of the number of hours that are flown and the number of people that are ferried around, in terms of the number of incidents that happen. And again, that safety is by design, and it's by those checklists. So here's an example. I've pinched off another presentation. Here's an example of a checklist that's strapped on the inside of someone's rebreather. So this is their pre-dive checks. Now, if you've got a checklist and you follow it through, it makes it almost impossible for you to cock it up, as long as you follow that checklist to the letter. And the reason why we make them short and simple is to prevent that human nature where we don't want to do something because it's a bit of a faff, okay? So the use of that checklist shouldn't be a burden. It should be very quick. Now, one way of mandating checklists and taking away some of the opportunity for them to fail is consider doing a call and response checklist. So instead of having this diver has their own checklist, perhaps if they're diving with a buddy, they can give that checklist to the buddy and say, okay, can you read out these and I will tell you that I've done them. And that makes it much more likely that they have definitely been done. This is why when we do buddy checks, the bar check or BWRAF, depending on who you subscribe to, those checklists, we tend to display them to each other. We ask the person in front of us, have they done those things? We demonstrate. It's a call and response. Okay. Now, an important thing to bear in mind, there will be an element of divers out there that probably need a little shake of the shoulders, but might view using a checklist as a sign of weakness. You can't remember everything or you can't be a good diver. Absolute nonsense. Using a checklist is a sign of strength. It's showing that you've got the most important things to mind, which is safety. The reason why you're doing the checklist is to stay safe and make yourself safe, make others safe. So this is why we do it. And checklists aren't necessarily just limited to a piece of paper. There are other checklists that you can do, other mnemonics, mantras that you can apply. One that comes to mind for me is one that I subscribe to a lot, which is the stop, breathe, think and act. This works for me whenever there's a situation underwater. You stop, you breathe, you have a think about it, and then you do whatever it is that you need to do to fix the problem. Obviously, that's all well and good as long as you've got air. But that methodology actually applies, when someone cuts you off in the car, someone pulls it, nearly causes a car crash. Don't necessarily go chasing them down and screaming at them through the window. Stop, breathe, have a think, and then act like an adult. Okay. Now, other things, so hopefully this is not going to come as a surprise. So there are thousands, like I said, of incidents logged with BSAC over the years. The incident report goes back many, many years. So we've got a massive body of knowledge there, massive number of incidents, okay? And each one of those incidents is a lesson that you can take away, and you can make yourself a better diver from it. So why not? Those incident reports are available. It's not just 2019 that's available, it's years going back and back and back. And I'm sure if you were to ask, you could probably get the really ancient ones. Now, I've got a quote here, not necessarily the most popular figure in the world, but Warren Buffett. He's quite renowned for the quote, "It's good to learn from your own mistakes, but it's better to learn from other people's mistakes," which is a fair point. We've publicized those incidents for you to look at. It's the incident report's not made for BSAC's own digestion. It's also there for you to learn from. So please do make use of it. Another thing which is important for you to do, and especially as you get through your diving career and you become more competent and more skilled, is accepting your own fallibility. Okay, overconfidence can hurt or even kill you, and it can hurt and kill other people. And I've seen this sign a few times published, and I think it's the first point is particularly salient. And I don't know if you can read that, but it's the sign reads, "Stop, prevent your death, go no farther." Fact, more than 300 divers, including open water scuba instructors, have died in caves just like this one. They've mentioned specifically open water scuba instructors, and I think that's an important point that they've tried to get to, which is that those individuals should have known better, but they didn't have the qualifications. It's that arrogance or the ego, or however you want to phrase it, overconfidence, that we really need to nip in the bud as we get more confident. If you've not seen it already, look up the Dunning-Kruger graph. It's quite telling, and see if you can plot where you are on that graph. A little bit of homework for you. Okay, so for those of you here right at the start, we had a poll, and I asked you guys a bunch of questions, and here are the results. Okay, so the first question was, have you ever rushed when putting your kit together when others have finished before you? And we got 54 of you today in the audience who said that you had. And that's quite telling, isn't it? Because after all you've heard today, you'll realise that that is a contributing factor to a diving incident. Just rushing in itself can bring you into a situation that quickly spirals out of control. What about this one? Have you ever found yourself overheating in a dry suit when a buddy took a little longer than you expected to kit up? 68 of you out of 82 said that you had overheated in a dry suit. Now that one's particularly salient because if you remember, I mentioned at the start of the session, one of those videos was covered the demise of Brian Bugg, and overheating in his dry suit prior to the dive was one of the contributing factors that led to that poor fellow passing away. So 68 of you, that's quite a lot. Let's have a look. Have you ever skipped or forgotten a buddy check? So this one, I'm glad to see, isn't such a big a skew as the rest. So you've got 39 people here who are on the up and up and have never done it. But we also have 41 people who potentially could have killed themselves on that dive by not doing that buddy check. I can't stress how important doing a buddy check is. What about, have you ever tried to squeeze an extra dive out of kit? And I'm even more glad to see that there's 45, the majority of people haven't tried to do it, but it's also equally concerning to see that 38 people have done it. We've done extra dives on kits which was due a service. It's easily done. But how much does the service cost, and what's the impact if you don't get the service? So something to think about yourself. look through the equipment section of the incident report and see how many of those dives related to equipment that malfunctioned. There's a lot of them in there that relate to free flows, and free flows are a very common side effect of poorly serviced regulators. Have you ever felt pressured to dive when you didn't feel confident? And thankfully, I'm really glad to see this, 25 people volunteered that they had felt pressured. 58 didn't feel that they'd been pressured at all, which is great to see that some of the teaching that BSAC puts in place, it's working. Okay, it's always an option to dive another day. You should always feel confident and empowered to say no. But the next one is going to be an interesting one. So of those people who felt pressured to dive, did you dive? Now this is an issue, isn't it? So there's 22 people there who said that they, or felt that they were pressured into diving and still went diving. That one of those fatalities there was a person who potentially felt pressured, whether that was pressure on themselves or pressure up by externals, peer pressure, to dive, and it resulted in their death. And I can't stress that enough, that extra pressure, you need to have the confidence and the resilience to be able to say, no, I'm not feeling it today. To heck with the cost of the dive. I'm sorry, that's it. It's not happening. So for those of you who stuck to the guns and said no, 15 of you, well done. I'm very proud of you. So I hope you took a little bit from those polls. I think that they're very interesting. I think I might keep those statistics, and yes, they are anonymous. I've not got anyone's email addresses. I might just send those to HQ because I think they're quite interesting, aren't they? So let's have a look at a summary before we wrap things up. So what have we covered today? So we've talked about why you should read the report. Hopefully you're as enthused as I am about why you should read from the report and what you should take from it. We've also dipped into human factors, sort of had a light touch on that area. And just remember, it's bsac.com/human factors to learn more, or you can just go to Google or Bing or whatever your search engine of choice is. Google human factors in diving, you'll find a huge wealth of resources out there. We've also been through those examples, and I hope I haven't scared you to death, but I hope I've actually opened your eyes a little bit to how these incidents can play out and how they can be caused by such small incidents that build up into something much bigger. And we've also talked about simple mitigation. So one of the simplest tools that's available to us to make sure that we don't get ourselves into sticky situations is just a checklist, making sure that we've got a list of things which is easy to follow and is going to cover all the important bases that we need to dive safely. So that's it from me. Thank you for joining me this evening. I'm going to now stop the recording and then we'll move on to the question and answers.